welcome everybody to this panel on activism and translation. I'm delighted to be chairing this evening. My name's Charlotte Ryland. My particular brand of activism is in bringing translation into schools in the UK as a way of getting young people to engage with international culture and the languages spoken in their communities. So in other words, it's about working against the monolingual monoculture that I consider to be a real curse for the country that I grew up in. I do this work through running two organisations, the Stephen Spender Trust and the Translation Exchange, which is, and the latter is based at Oxford University, and I'm speaking from Oxford tonight. I'm not expecting to talk too much about my work because we have three awesome people on the panel this evening who represent this translatorly activism from different perspectives, and there's going to be so much to talk about that I think we'll have plenty to say. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then after that there will be time for questions. So as we go along, if questions occur to you, do feel free to add them either into the chat or you can use the Q&A function, and we will then address as many of those as possible as we can after our discussion. So translation activism is clearly a massive topic, and we want to make sure that in the hour or so that we have together, we can get into specifics and consider concrete action. And we're going to start this by really boiling things down. So when I think about this topic, as I have been doing increasingly over the past years, and then a lot over the past week, when I think about this, there are certain words that kind of pop up into my head and stay there and like really resonate. And I found that thinking about these kind of individual words and concepts a really helpful way of navigating through what can be quite complex. And so that's what I've asked our panelists to start with this evening. Each of our three panelists is going to start by talking about one word that particularly resonates for them in this context of translation and activism, and we'll sort of use that to kickstart our discussion. So firstly, I'm going to ask Anna von Rath to contribute. Anna is based in Berlin. She's a freelance diversity trainer, editor, and translator. Anna's long been interested in post-colonialism, eco-criticism, and Afropolitanism. And these interests have led her to co-found two really fascinating activist projects that we'll be hearing more about this evening. I'm just going to mention them briefly. One is called poco.lit, and it's a bilingual platform for post-colonial literature. And one is called Marchbrache, which for the non-German speakers in the audience roughly translates as power language. And it's a project that aims to foster politically sensitive translation. So, Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I would like to talk a little bit about translation and visibility. And as you mentioned, I am a co-founder of the platform poco.lit, and we use translation to create more visibility for lesser known literary voices. Poco.lit is basically a bilingual online magazine for post-colonial literature in the widest sense, and we run it in English and in German. And I'd like to explain to you why this is important. As you know now, I'm based in Germany, and I only really learned about German colonialism when I started to study English at university. At university, we spoke about colonial modes of representation, about colonially determined power relations, about colonial legacies that still have an effect on our present time. And all of this was new to me and super fascinating. And then I realized that in the German public, this is not really discussed. And I also realized that it's very difficult to find post-colonial literature in German or in relation to the German context, even though it exists. And then I also noticed that post-colonial theories and the terminology around them are often imported from the Anglo-American contexts, and that English is probably the language that kind of dominates in the field. And yeah, so I wanted to create more visibility for all of this here in Germany, and I co-founded, or I saw the need for a platform like poco.lit. And what we do now is that we make relevant English texts accessible to German audiences, and we highlight the German, the post-colonial literature that is developing in Germany, and make it accessible to English speakers. And we really benefit from being a team of someone whose first language is English, and then someone whose first language is German, myself, because we not only get to create greater visibility for the topics, but we also get to draw attention to the differences, but also to the similarities that exist in the post-colonial field. And our discussions about the content and translating a lot of the content ourselves have led to further projects, but I'm sure I'll get to talk about this a little bit more later, and I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks. That's so fascinating. I'm particularly interested in this idea of imported concepts and how that's not always that's not always good enough, really. That there needs to be this kind of homegrown development of the discourse. So I'm sure we can come on to that shortly. But I'm now going to introduce our second panelist. Yousif Qasmiyeh is a poet, a translator, and a researcher. He's also based in Oxford at the English faculty, where he's writing a doctoral thesis on refugee writing in English and Arabic. Actually, refugee writing is in inverted commas, which we may also come on to later. Yousif's poetry and translations have been published in numerous journals, including Modern Poetry and Translation and the Cambridge Literary Review. And his poetry collection, Writing the Camp, was published this year to great acclaim. Like Anna, Yousif works on collaborative activist projects alongside his writing, including the Refugee Hosts Research Project, where he's writer in residence, and the Imagining Futures Badawi Camp Lab. And I hope that we'll have time as well to hear more about these. But Yousif, over to you for your word to start us off.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And it's a huge honor to be, of course, in the presence of such wonderful people. As you've just said, in fact, my perhaps understanding of a translation stems from my own work, when I translated from Arabic into English and from English into Arabic. And given that we're talking about specific terms, perhaps, that resonate with our translation and how translation, in fact, is understood perhaps first by ourselves before we theorize it or conceptualize it, perhaps further afield. In fact, for me, the term would be hospitality. And here, perhaps I would like to shed light on the etymology as well in the Arabic language of this term, and how the term itself is premised on addition, in fact, the extra, what you're adding to something that is already stable. And of course, Derrida himself did talk and theorize, in fact, hospitality in the way that the term itself embodies hostility. So he came up with the coinage hospitality, in fact. And this tension, and the tension that is inherent in the word, as Derrida, of course, theorizes, and the term and how it's understood in the Arabic language, that these, perhaps, let's call them maybe tropes, have enabled us at refugee hosts to also explore the term in practice through writing and translation workshops in the refugee camps, mainly in Lebanon and in Jordan. So for us to view the text as a hospitable place, or perhaps more precisely as a hospitable space, because it embodies time as well, and how to work from within this text, the text that is written by a particular participant, and to end up with maybe a multiplicity of texts and interpretations and versions of this very same text. I think that this in itself is so important because we're talking here, or we're highlighting the collaborative nature of translation. And in the Arabic language, those, of course, who are familiar with the language, we talk about different registers and in particular different dialects. And to be able, in fact, to transform these dialects, the dialects that belong to the individual, and this individual belongs to a specific space and time, into a text is something that has been quite fascinating, but also paradoxical and at times quite violent, because the moment we talk about the text here, we're talking about who is giving the text itself and who is receiving it. So this particular tension also has been viewed by us as a team, and also throughout the work that we've been doing, as perhaps a platform and also as a common ground to begin with, but also to return to. And these dynamics are incredibly important as we also talk about hospitality from a hierarchical perspective. The person who gives, the person who receives, and also the ways in which a text can be interpreted in a hospitable manner by involving people who have created the text in the first place.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Yousif. So much there. And we'll certainly hope to come on to talking about that idea of multiplicity and collaboration. It's absolutely central, I think, to this whole question. I did want to jump in onto the hospitality bandwagon, because about a year and a half ago, well, really early on in the pandemic, I heard the author Olivia Laing talking on BBC Radio about, I think it was about her new book, and she said something that I then scribbled down on a piece of paper and stuck to the wall above my desk, and it's been there for the past 18 months, and I haven't known what to do with it, but it really resonated with me. So I was so pleased to hear you talking about hospitality. So she said, art is a tool for hospitality. Art is a tool for encountering minds and ways of thinking unlike our own, for welcoming strangeness as well as strangers. There are clearly loads of ways that we can problematize that statement as well. But for me, when I heard her say that, I just thought, replace art with translation, and you've got it. Translation is a tool for hospitality, for welcoming strangeness as well as strangers. And there are kind of complex dynamics in there. But I do love that idea, and I think it's really powerful, and one that we can keep with us as we discuss. So thank you very much, Yousif. I'm now going to turn to Canan Marasligil, who is a feminist writer, literary translator, artist, editor, and curator. Canan works in English, French, Turkish, and Dutch, occasionally in Spanish. She is an intersectional feminist who strives to challenge dominant narratives. And as part of this, she's launched the Creative Translators Workshop for the Read My World Festival. This aims to create a pool of diverse translators and multilingual storytellers to work with the festival. Again, I hope we'll hear more about this and Canan's other projects. But for now, I'll invite you, Canan, to share your word to start the discussion.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. So my word is transparency. When I thought about this, I thought, is it a wish or is it already something happening? In my case, in my own practice, it is something I value a lot, transparency. Why? Because I believe that if people know why I make the choices I make, why I select the books or the text I select to translate, it really enters in, it gives a better understanding of what translation and activism means, because we do translate based on choices, and these choices can be of a variety of choices. And in the case of activism, in my personal case, these are all linked to my own biography, to my own vision of the world. You just said I'm an intersectional feminist. This will always be part of the choices I make. And transparency for me is key in showing the process behind how I work. And I always encourage, also through the work I do with other translators, writers, to be open about our processes. And that can sometimes be scary because you also show the mistakes along the way. That's why maybe people sometimes shy away from that. But I would advocate for more transparency in our practices. But that also links to the overall need for transparency also in politics, in the world we live in. We've seen in this pandemic, the lack of transparency in the choices our politicians made has been quite catastrophic for all of us. So as citizens, we also yearn for more transparency. So this is something for me that is key, especially when you look at translation in the context of activism.
Wonderful, thank you, Canan. Plenty of food for thought there, and I really like that idea of recognizing mistakes and not hiding from them, but bringing them into the discussion. Nobody is perfect. Okay, what we would like to do before we really launch into this discussion is involve those of you in the audience by inviting you to take part in a survey. So I'm hoping that our hosts, here we go. So if you like, then please feel free to take part in this Umfrage, this survey. Translation is always political and neutrality is not an option. You can just agree, disagree, or not sure. It's anonymous. And then once everybody who wants to has voted, we will see what the outcome is and just get a bit of a sense of the views in the room before we continue with our discussion. While everybody's doing that, I can just remind you of our 3 words that we started with, which are visibility, hospitality, and transparency. They are clearly all words that are going to echo throughout our discussion this evening. The other thing that really struck me with those introductions is how it was impossible for me to introduce any of the panelists without saying a list of roles that they fulfill. Nobody is sort of only a translator or a curator or an editor or a writer. In this field, it seems very, very common for people to take on multiple roles. And I think that also really relates to our discussion this evening. This question of how translation and activism relate to one another, I think really invites us to ask what are the different ways in which we can be activists? And there are various roles that the translator, that those working within the field of translation and international literature can take. And that's one of the things that we're going to use as our sort of anchor through this discussion. And I hope that by the end we'll have identified a sort of set of different activist roles that people, including those in the audience can take. But we now have our answers, and this is quite interesting. So out of 43 who voted, 21 agree, 5 disagree, and 17 are not sure. It might be quite interesting to do a survey again at the end, but anyway, let's see. Thank you very much for that. Okay. So, talking of activist roles, the first one that I want to look at is thinking about the translator as advocate and awareness raiser. Sorry, that's not a very nice word. An advocate is somebody who raises awareness, and they can raise awareness for and advocate for all sorts of things, for particular languages, for individual writers, for types of literature. And the translator as advocate really relates to visibility, transparency, and hospitality. I think it's all in there. So Anna, I wanted to come back to you on this question of the translator as advocate, and one who raises awareness for particular types of literature. One thing that struck me in your introduction is that you really focused on the German context quite understandably. Are you thinking that this might be something that could be applied to other contexts? Is there something particularly German and in English about it? How do you see this developing?
Yes, so I think it's definitely something that can be done, or that translators can do in all kinds of different contexts. But as I said, with regard to post-colonialism, it's something that in Germany is not as much discussed, or hasn't been. It's changing at the moment, because I think quite some time Germans were so focused on the Holocaust and on working on that part of their history, that other things like German colonialism kind of went out of focus. And what also often happens here is that that people say, oh, well, we didn't do colonialism for that long, so we don't really have to go into it, really. And I think, so it's for me, as I said, it was important to learn from the English context, and then to realize that this applies here too. And I think translation is very important to create a greater awareness for that. And in other contexts, the stories will be a little bit different, but then again, there will be other narratives that translation can kind of question or break open or change or intervene into, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And is it, do you sort of work a lot on the publicity side of things? I'm just sort of thinking about how you reach the people that you want to reach in order to make the change that you want to change, because that's the challenge, isn't it? When you kind of have a platform and the content is clearly very powerful, but you want to make sure that it's reaching the right people in order to change minds and raise awareness. Is that something that is an important, that you see as an important part of your role as well?
Yes, of course. So what we do next to publishing reviews of books or essays about post-colonial topics, or interviews with relevant people, we have become active on social media to try and reach audiences through this medium. And then also we host events regularly or irregularly, and so we have different kinds of formats that we use to reach audiences, and I also have to say that we always try to use a language that's also accessible to broader audiences, which of course is sometimes difficult because I have an academic background, and most of the people who participate in poco.lit, they do as well. But so we try to keep the reviews short, to use accessible language and to just get people involved.
Yeah. Canan, is this idea of advocacy and sort of raising awareness of certain literatures or certain writers, is that something that you see as part of your role?
Oh yes, definitely. And it started since as someone who coming from a family of Turkish immigrants in Western Europe, growing up in the heart of Brussels as a young Turkish girl, seeing how Turkey was represented or misrepresented, and the lack of visibility, actually, to come back to what Anna was talking about, that gave me the urge to, since very young, oh, I have to tell other stories coming from this place my family comes from, and I know differently. And that, of course, has transformed throughout the years as I learn more and more about, freedom of expression and other major issues, especially in Turkey, when we see certain undemocratic practices, how certain writers write about this in their literature, in their, whether it's in fiction or nonfiction. Then I started moving towards these voices and feel the need to translate these voices into French first, and then also into English. And later on, this also evolved, because more and more now I see myself working outside of the book, because I also realized there was a whole space outside of the book telling stories, where you can also create these advocacy moments through festivals, through empowering other translators and give tools to other translators to use these stories to advocate for social justice, LGBTQ rights, anti-racism. So this, I have evolved a lot in my journey as a translator, but since the beginning, it was always the urge to tell stories that are rejected by a mainstream.
Yeah, which really relates to this idea of visibility, doesn't it? And this is, this idea of visibility is such a complex one, because of course it's the question of to whom are these voices and these stories and these people visible, and to whom are they invisible, and to whom are we making them visible. And so I think it really goes to the core of this issue of what translators can do, and how it's kind of shifting perspectives can make such a difference. Yousif, this makes me think of when I was introducing you and I said, refugee writing in inverted commas, and that idea of it sort of strikes me that perhaps in advocating for refugee writing as part of your work, you're also kind of defining what refugee writing might be understood to be. Is that correct?
I would say perhaps maybe critique it, but also sort of transform it perhaps into a bearer or a container of multiple interpretations and perceptions. And I think I still remember vividly that when some graduate students here at Oxford approached me to run a translation workshop through PEN, but also through 2 or 3 different bodies within the university. And from the beginning, I wanted to make sure that for instance, running a translation workshop on, let's say, Syrian poetry, and of course, this is not to delimit or demarcate what the poetry produced by Syrians is, but to tell also people that we should not, in fact, respond to people's, and I'm talking about, of course, refugees, and about people being forced to leave their countries, authors, writers, but also workers and wives and husbands. So not to in fact, to respond seasonally or circumstantially to the writing or writings in the plural, perhaps, of these people, of these individuals. And we should not, in fact, dwell on suffering, because these people can, in fact, write and they can translate. So the question of representation here is something that I have always sort of contested, because as I've, in fact, written in a piece, that to embroider the voice with its own needle. People do not need, in fact, to be given voices. They have their own. So it's about mainly saying that there is equity, that you can speak and I can speak in the same space, and you can write and you can translate. So these are, and also not to expect the refugee author, and I'm talking here about myself as a refugee, as somebody who arrived in the country, in the UK, as an asylum seeker, and then evolved to become a refugee and then a citizen from a Palestinian refugee camp in North Lebanon, not to be reduced into the legality of my status. And that is why, in fact, the expectation that at times brown and maybe black authors need to dwell on the autobiographical in order to be, or to occupy a very specific center. And these are things that maybe through advocacy, but also to raise awareness, we have to remember that this should not be seasonal, and this should not respond to people's tragedies. It should be a holistic, perhaps, approach to translation as a whole, and how we perceive it as people who translate and write.
Yeah, thank you. I was really struck there by what you said about this idea of giving voice, which of course is, and we talk about marginalized voices, and it's clearly so problematic, and it relates to this visibility idea. I think perhaps what the shift needs to be towards listening instead of, we're not giving voice, but we're creating a space in which listening to those voices which exist and seeing those faces which are visible is possible. And this relates to sort of another role that I think the translator can take, which is to work with what we often refer to as gatekeepers. So gatekeepers in this world of international culture that we're moving in order to create that space where that listening and that seeing can happen. So that's my big question to anybody who would like to take it. How do we create that space, and how do we do so by working with those gatekeepers, because they can't be avoided?
Yeah, I'm jumping in, but it's very difficult because when you think, I think we should remember that literature is an industry as well, the publishing industry. So what's the primary goal is profit, right? It's a profit-oriented industry. So that plays a key role in how these gatekeepers think. They think of a certain audience, there's a market, and what kind of stories does this market want? So to me, this is always very problematic, and I always work against that, because the stories I bring, usually I'm told there's no market for this, nobody's interested. But then I think I'm interested, so there are other people like me out there. If you don't have the imagination to create the audience, that's not my problem. So I have enough imagination to try to find these people. But of course, I don't have the same resources. I don't have the same PR machine behind me. I don't have all these tools that help you sell these books. So there is this reality I think we always need to keep in mind. And that's why for me, transparency was always important. We don't always know exactly how these choices are made, There are these immense book fairs where things happen, agents sell books. So there's a whole machinery behind that the public is not aware of. And they think that this bestseller is, wow, wonderful example of that country. Whereas if you go to ask people who work in that country, they say, no, this book is really not a good book. We don't understand why this has been translated. So I think this is this reality that the public is not really aware of. This is something we need to work against sometimes. I'm not saying that all publishing is bad, absolutely not. There are lots of wonderful work done in also mainstream publishing. Not everything that's mainstream is bad. That's also not what I'm saying. But there are mechanisms we need to be aware of. And in a profit-oriented system, our work is, of course, a bit more difficult, because personally, the things I try to do are less marketable and not easy to sell. So this is one of the things I need to work against. And this is where I find strategies, and this is where solidarity becomes important, collective work becomes important, and finding really building your own tribe among translators, writers, independent publishers, people who want to join join forces to do this together. And there is an audience for it. I think we need to have a bit more imagination, because there are people who are interested in these texts and these voices.
Yeah.
Can I add to this?
Please do.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree, and I think in my role as a translator, I can kind of also function as a mediator once I have established my contacts with publishing houses, with editors there. I can also make suggestions, or I don't know, promote books that I think that need to be translated. Another thing that I can do is when I do a translation and it's, I don't know, something of a political topic, or let's once again go to post-colonialism, then I can negotiate with the publishing house about the terminology that's used. And I do know that my power as a translator is limited, but at least I can try. What I can also do, especially as a white translator, I can kind of suggest other translators to publishing houses, and create more awareness also that we do have colleagues of color that they could also approach, who might not yet be part of their network. So it's kind of like sharing the networks and yeah, trying to function as someone who mediates.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And certainly mediating, and also solidarity is a word that's constantly, is another one of these words that's constantly coming up for me in this context. And I think, you know, we don't need to be thinking about ourselves as confrontational, sort of as against the publishers or against the festivals, in a kind of it's much more about working together and acknowledging that, you know, everybody is busy. There, those who are working in profit-making organisations always have that bottom line and that pressure often from above. And what we can do is to help them to make good decisions and make good choices, as you might say, Canan, by giving them those tools and by raising that awareness. But that does quite kind of come back to an individual responsibility as well as a collective one, I think, doesn't it? Canan, could I ask you a little bit more about your work with literary festivals and how that fits in?
Yes, for instance, one concrete example I'm doing there's an independent literature festival in Amsterdam called Read My World, and I'm one of the program's curator there since 2018. And one of the things I've started is a program for translators. The first year we called it the Performative Translators Workshop, because what we realize is that lots of writers that are invited to festivals abroad, for instance, in the Netherlands, there's always a filter happening already, because festivals or event organizers only invite writers who either can express themselves in English or another Western European language, which is easier to translate. But there's always this initial filter, and then you ask a lot for the writers, and you realize it's always the same writers within this whole circuit of festivals, because they are well trained, they know how to speak the language, they have all the codes. And then we realized maybe what we should do is make translation part of the event itself, and show, again, coming back to transparency, have the translator on stage with the writer and have them translate, not as an interpreter, but more like a performance. So the writer would express themselves in their own language, and you have a translator on stage who translates, maybe summarizes. It's not perfect, but the audience gets it because you're there in the presence of the writer, so you feel the emotions as well. One wonderful example I love to give is at one event around motherhood, the writers were telling about their experiences in writing in relationship to motherhood. And one of the writers from Morocco, she was telling about this very conflicted relationship with her mother. And she got very emotional. And when the translator, also a young woman from Moroccan descent living in France, she started translating, and she became very emotional and stopped, and she said, I'm sorry, I have also conflicts with my own mother like this, and I recognize myself. And they looked at each other, they got up and hugged on stage. And that's the moment when I thought, this is translation, because the translator brought her own emotions into it. And we come back to hospitality, right? They accepted each other's stories. And this happened on stage. This happened in transparency. You know, we link here to all our words: visibility, transparency, hospitality. It's all in this example. And this is beautiful. We shouldn't think this is a mistake. It happened on stage. Everybody saw it. The whole audience was moved by seeing this. And they understood that translation is complex. And we also gave the space to the writer to express themselves in their own language, which is also, I think, very important, because you don't express yourself in the same way in the different languages you speak in. And we cannot expect from writers to always express themselves in a second, third, fourth language sometimes. So what is our role as festival? And coming back to the gatekeepers, changing the mindset of the gatekeepers when they think about events. It is not an issue to have a translator on stage if you do it in an imaginative way, if you give the space so that the audience is also part of the process. And I think that's very powerful. And I would hope that more festivals use this approach so that they stop thinking that everything needs to be in one language just for the audience to enjoy it. I think the audience also enjoys multilingual events. Yes. And they also enjoy seeing this.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's so powerful, and it kind of moves away from this idea that I think has been the case with literary festivals, where multilingualism is seen as a weakness or presented as a weakness. You know, like, let's pretend that this book wasn't actually written in another language. Sometimes the writer is asked to read out the English translations, you know, read out their own words in somebody else's version that they could never do justice to in the way that they could to their own words in the language in which they wrote it. And I think, you know, a lot of this work, you know, the sort of bigger picture around this is showing that none of this is weakness. This is all, you know, this multiplicity that Yousif has talked about is all something that, you know, must be embraced and must be shown and made visible. And it's only through doing that which is often, you know, difficult, that we will kind of move on to a better place, wherever that might be. Yeah, thank you. That's really, really wonderful, and that does give me hope as well for festivals and for this idea of how we work with the gatekeeper.
I just want to add one thing about this. This is, of course, it requires more resources and more money, which is one of the reasons, of course, festivals, especially smaller ones, may think, oh, how am I going to do this? So this is a call out to the funders, so funding bodies that should add this into their requests. Like, every festival needs to have a program around translation. So if it works at that level, maybe it will help also support festivals. Again, it comes back to the tools we need to create collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one issue that we have in this country in particular is that because we can safely assume that a decent number of contributors will speak English, it's not thought to be necessary to have that translation program, and that is just a terrible loss for us. But something that we can all collectively do something about. It's nearly time to move on to audience questions, but I wanted to come back to Yousif, and I think still in the context of gatekeepers, Yousif, you're based here at the university, you work with sort of sociological projects, and you're a sort of literary editor for a sociological journal, I think I'm right in saying. Is this something quite conscious? It seems that there's a lot of kind of disruption and breaking down of boundaries happening in your work. Is that a conscious act? Absolutely. I think that because what's very unfortunate is that literature has been an extra at times in certain research projects. So to tick certain boxes, you have to
to incorporate a bit of the humanities, and this in itself is rather not just tokenistic, but also, I would say, dangerous, in fact, on the long run. So from the very beginning, we wanted to ensure that literature is there, and literature, it's not just the multidisciplinarity of the project and also interrupting disciplines or perhaps at times conflating them, but in fact, how do we at times when we conduct research, this is really, I would say, fascinating, but also incredibly difficult. When you interview people who cannot write and who can't read, and yet you end up translating their voices. And this is something that so what we did, in fact, is and we didn't do them favors. Again, it's their right, in fact, to tell what they want to tell. And for some of the participants, not ourselves, to transcribe for them, or to transcribe in collaboration with this speaker or with the person who was narrating. My mother can't write and she can't read. At the moment, I'm working with her, in fact, on roughly 20 texts, mainly for her to tell me exactly what she would like to say about a certain, let's say, image. And for me to transcribe and for me to translate as well. And this is something that has started not long ago, but it's really quite important to acknowledge that people who can't, in fact, read and write should be incorporated in translation, not just they should sit on the side and not be part of the process. So at least what we've managed to do is to acknowledge, and this acknowledgement, in fact, we have to acknowledge it as well, came by sheer coincidence, because we were confronted by people who did not read and they didn't write. So on the spot, we needed to respond to their presence. And it wasn't a charitable act. In fact, it has hugely enriched our work. And to be able to see things transcribed by different individuals, we're talking about the handwritten, we're talking about the voice, we're talking about the textual, in fact, facets of the actual translation. All these elements have contributed, in fact, towards the creation of, as I said before, this multiple text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that really, I think, reflects this idea that this kind of activism always requires you to go the extra mile, right? You could have done that workshop and encountered those people who weren't able to contribute by writing and said, okay, sorry, we can't include you because we have this plan. And I think that the activism that we're talking about, always has to come from really pushing the boundaries, using your imagination, forcing others to use theirs, getting additional funding, as Canan says, and really not accepting those limitations which appear from all angles. It's really, it's really inspiring. I am going to just ask one more question of Anna, and then we'll move on to audience questions. So do pop questions into the chat or into the Q&A if you'd like to ask anything. We've talked a lot about collaboration in different ways, and I think it was Canan who talked about finding your tribe and building your tribe. I love that idea. I think translation has become such a communal act. There's so much solidarity in the community now, and I think that really does stand us in good stead. Of course, Anna, your project that we haven't properly talked about yet, Marchbrache, is a essentially collaborative project. Could you just tell us a little bit about that to close, and how the sort of how important it is that has become such a collaborative activity?
Yes, I'd love to. So as I said in the beginning, my colleague and I, we create content for poco.lit, and often we translate it ourselves. And in that context, we realized that there are particular terms that are incredibly difficult to translate. And we're mostly speaking about politically sensitive terms, so everything that has to do with any kind of discrimination. And that's why we thought it would be really helpful to have some sort of text checker that you can maybe use in a similar way to, for example, DeepL or something, or Google Translate, so that you can just copy a part of a text into a field, and then it shows you politically sensitive terms, and it kind of helps you with the translation or gives some information about these terms and concepts. But to get to this point, we created the Marchbrache project, yeah, as you said, it's a collaborative project. We started by building a discussion platform, which you can actually find under marchbrache.de. Everybody can join the discussion there, and we invite people to discuss particular terms, but also terms in context. So you can put in examples from books or movies or theater subtitles and so on, and discuss the term and the translation in context. And all of this will flow into the final tool, into that text checker that I mentioned. And then throughout the year, we also we are hosting a couple of events with experts, and then we focus on different areas, so to say. We had one that had a stronger focus on gender, then we had one that had a stronger focus on race. The next one will happen in 2 weeks, which is also a collaboration with the Goethe-Institut, that will have a focus on disability in translation. And so we invite experts who have things to say about these topics, and then all of this knowledge will finally flow into the tool, which we are already building behind the scenes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, I can see a question has reached me, so I'm going to ask that in a second. I think I just wanted to close this discussion by referring to the great translator Anthea Bell. It's not International Translation Day if you don't mention Anthea Bell, because all of this talk about visibility obviously makes me think about what Anthea used to say and has written about the invisibility of the translator. And of course, she was talking about that on a textual basis, and a great translator not being visible in the text that they translate. But it seems to me that we're in a different place now, that invisibility is no longer an option, to go back to our survey question at the beginning, and that it's the responsibility of the translator to intervene. And it's been really wonderful to hear the ways in which that's happening on a very practical level with our 3 panelists this evening. So I'm going to ask a question now that's come from the audience. So this is for all 3 of you. Regarding the use of correct and respectful terminology, as in the giving voice debate, what do you think about translators calling themselves advocates for the voices they translate? So back to that question of advocacy, in particular, advocating for somebody else's voice.
Well, I'm jumping in again. I don't call myself an advocate of anyone. I advocate for issues I care about that are related mostly to social justice, freedom of expressions, and equality for all, LGBTQ rights. So these are the issues I work on, and these are the topics that interest me, but I do not represent anyone. I do not advocate for anyone in particular. If I see that there are interesting texts, interesting work done by people that has not yet been translated, I will do my utmost to get these translated, promoted, and shown into the context where I am based and where I have the privilege to be able to work in this way without being in danger. Nobody's going to arrest me. Nobody's trying to kill me. So I am very privileged. So I use my privilege for this, but I am in no way giving voice, and I'm no way an advocate for people in particular. So I focus on the issues, and I create tools so that more people can join in into these efforts to create more democratic, open societies. This is really my goal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anna or Yousif, would you like to contribute on that?
I think that we did, in fact, we did dwell on this, and we did answer it, Anna and myself. And of course, I'm not talking for Anna, but we did perhaps respond to this. So we're not spokespeople for, again, for specific individuals, but to showcase work has nothing to do with the sort of, let's call it, the personal impulse and how we respond to people's work. So I think that the question of voice is something that, again, I've always myself critiqued and questioned. So I've got mine, and people, they have theirs, and this is how I see things as a translator, as a writer, as also a parent of a child. So I have to listen, and listening, in fact, is mutual.
Yeah, thank you. Another great question here. I wondered if the panelists could discuss any encounters with minority languages and dialects through their work. I think there is an idea that any translations of these are too niche, so any translation itself could be seen as activism. So encounters with minority languages and dialects, and the extent to which that is kind of automatically activism because they're so niche.
And I would like to jump in.
Sure, Yousif, yeah.
I did talk about, of course, as a speaker of the Arabic language. So within the Arabic language, we have dialects, and this is, and even, for example, when we run workshops and people, they haven't been to schools and they speak their own dialect. They don't speak the formal Arabic register, or they don't write, let's say, in a sound type of Arabic. But these are things that are wonderful to see, these dialectal, let's call them maybe inflections within their writings. And we try, and of course, to the best of our ability, to sort of to keep them. And at times, in fact, to mainly offer them not just different translations, but also different alternatives within the Arabic language before we move them to the English language. So these are the things that we've covered, and I'm talking here not just about myself, but also about the team within these research projects. So dialects are rather prevalent and I would say hyper visible in our work. And this is not something that we've tried to homogenize or standardize.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, I can maybe add an anecdote to that. I recently did an interview with the translator Anna von Rath, who translated Akaike Emezi's The Death of Vivek Oji. So the book is set in Nigeria and it's written in English, but a lot of, I think, Igbo terms appear. And I mean, Anna von Rath, she's a translator from French and English into German. And so that was a kind of a new challenge, but it's a challenge that's very common when you work with post-colonial literature or African literature written in English, because a lot of these novels, even if they're written in English, you encounter different languages. And I think that also kind of relates to something that we haven't really spoken about tonight, but that we talked about when we prepared for this event, that there are different kinds of Englishes, and yeah, usually when we hear English, we probably immediately think of British or American English here. Well, at least in Germany we do. And yeah, so but there are a lot more varieties, and that's also something that that translators have to deal with.
Absolutely, thank you. It also reminds me of something that Canan said when we were talking before this event about the idea of there being no difference between translation and activism. Actually, you know, this question is kind of saying, well, that by translating something that might be considered a minor language or a dialect, you are automatically doing activist work. And I think that really can be extended. Sorry to steal your words, Canan, but they really stayed with me. Be extended to kind of the whole act of translation is always going to be a form of activism. And that may be a good point to close. I have noted down some sort of words related to this question of the roles, the activist roles that translators can take. And actually, just to warn you, panel, I'm going to ask you in a minute for if you have a sort of a suggestion of a concrete action for the audience. But before we come to that, so I think here are just some ideas of what's come up in the discussion today. A translator is somebody who advocates, as discussed, who raises awareness, who resists, who opens gates, who disrupts, who negotiates, who collaborates, who multiplies. And there are many more words that we could add to that. But I think what the discussion has shown is that it's a very rich area. There's a lot more work to be done, but it's so great to hear about what's happening. And could I ask the panel for this final contribution to share with our audience one concrete action that you would suggest everybody could do in order to further this activist cause? Anna, do you want to start? Oh, Canan, go on.
Well, it's a very easy one, actually. I don't know if it's really activism, but it's very simple about the visibility of the translators. If you see mentions of translated books where the translator is not mentioned, ask for the translator to be mentioned, whether it's on social media, whether it's by email to the publisher, whichever way is comfortable for you. If you see the translator is not being mentioned, ask for them to be mentioned.
Thank you. Name the translator. Wonderful. Anna?
Yes, I can go next. I fully support to name the translator, obviously. Yeah, but I would also say, if you are translating, make sure that you have the necessary expertise, or that you know who to ask, what books or websites or Facebook groups to consult if you're unsure. I think what helps me a lot when I'm translating is generally talking to other people.
Thank you. Great. And Yousif?
Perhaps logistically, this is quite difficult to sort of, I would say, to maintain, but to make sure maybe, or to inspire towards the inclusion of what we call benignly the original language alongside the translation. I think that at times we assume that people, in fact, do not speak or do not know the language, for instance, or the original language. But in fact, at times, the visual, the actual script, the lines, the overlapping, perhaps at times invisible voices across the script, these are really fascinating features that should not be compromised and should not be only added in a sort of tokenistic or reductionist manner. just to always exist alongside the text.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's also an unhelpful assumption that people might be put off by seeing a language that they don't recognize or that they don't understand, and that feeds into the problems that we're dealing with rather than helping solve them. So yeah, I think that's a really great contribution. Thank you so much. There was one more question, Anna Marie. I'm really sorry that we're not going to be able to address your question. How do you overcome losing meaning through translation? I feel like we need a whole new panel discussion for that one, but thank you for that question. Thank you everybody for listening. Thank you Anna, Canan and Yousif for taking part and sharing your reflections, and for the really proactive work that you're doing to challenge the status quo. It's great to know that it's happening, and we look forward to following your project as they continue. Thank you very much to the Goethe-Institut in London for conceiving of this event, hosting it, bringing us all together, enabling us to have two wonderful conversations about this topic and to share that with you. This event is connected to a project, an international project run by the Goethe-Institut called Artificially Correct, which highlights issues connected to bias in translation, which of course in many ways bias is sort of the elephant in the room of this whole discussion. It has a particular interest in machine translation, and on Friday, a hackathon starts, which is a 3-day event looking at how to spot and tackle bias in machine translation. So if you're interested in that, hopefully there'll be a link, or you can go to the Goethe-Institut website and look for the Artificially Correct hackathon as a way of, indeed, that could be your concrete action to take forward. But yeah, thank you so much everybody for listening, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the evening. Thanks very much.